So I had got some really good questions from the last video that I did around listening to the logos, and it was basically on my last, to summarize the last video, I talked about how we don't listen to the logos. We hear it, we respond to it. On some level, we probably live in its measure, in its products, its results, but we don't necessarily have a listening for the non-contingent wholeness of the logos, right? And the more that happens, we don't, well, the more than that happens, the more our lives become a pure kind of contingency, right? It's like I'm doing something as a means to produce an outcome or an effect, which will become the next means or thing that I need to produce an outcome and an effect. And there's a way in which we can kind of like we can basically, our whole lives can become a pure contingency, right? So let's not do that. Easier said than done, because we don't hear that we're not listening. And because we've lost sight, right, of that we're listening, that we have a listening, I think we end up just only hearing the products of the logos and not the living dynamic, the principle of principles, right? The not, like, being in its non-contingency, right? Its luminosity, its suchness, its moreness. So one of the questions, there were two questions. One was that somebody asked was, they're like, great, let's listen. Agreed, we don't listen. But challenge, how do you encourage somebody to listen who doesn't hear that they're listening, therefore doesn't even know to ask the question on how to listen, basically, is what I heard. And then the other one was, where do you listen from? That was another person. I just saw it in maybe there was more to it, but I only just saw it on my walk over here. So I just wanted to respond to both of those. So I think what we can, I really like those questions. It's having me think about it. So here are my thoughts about that. So it's interesting because in regards to how do we encourage someone to listen to that they're not listening, because listening really isn't possible until we can hear that we're not listening. And the moment it's revealed to us we're not listening is probably the first time perhaps in our lives that we actually listen. So how do we do that, right? Well, it's interesting when you think about it, right? If we ask ourselves, when I deeply listen to somebody, they're speaking and they're telling me about their lives, or they're telling me what they think, and they're revealing to whatever depth they're revealing about whatever it is that they think or feel or experiencing. When I listen, what am I actually hearing? What am I listening to? Well, I would have to say that if we say that listening, right, if listening is what all speech is in a response to, we would have to say that speaking doesn't make any sense until there's a listening. There must have been something that called forth something like speech. So when we listen to another speech and we really listen to it, I think what we hear and what they can maybe hear us hearing is what they're in response to. I think that's what happens a lot when somebody says they feel deeply seen or deeply gotten. It's not so much that I feel like you heard or saw the attributes of myself, or that you even heard what I think to myself, but it's more like you heard the world in which I'm already always responding to, and that there's a way I hear it, and thus my speaking is a response to it. So when I hear you and I get you and I deeply listen to you, on some level, I am, in my response, I'm actually revealing you're listening. And I think, so in a strange way, I guess maybe the answer to that question is to how do we encourage someone to hear that they're not listening? I think it's to deeply listen to them. And now to the question, and I'm sure they'll end up being related. Oftentimes when I start a sentence, I think I know what I'm going to say. And by the end I'll start the sentence, and by the end of it, I'll realize I have no idea what I was trying to say. So we'll see if that's the case or not in this way. So where do I hear from? Or where does listening happen from? It's a great question. In some sense, right, it's kind of a similar question of, if I ask myself, right, what will it take to really attend to the world in front of me? Especially if the world in front of me calls forth a quality of attention I don't currently have. Yet I feel called in to pay attention, or to listen, or to understand. But yet I don't have the capacity to understand. Yet, so how do I become worthy of the kind of understanding for which I don't have yet to be able to understand? Well, if that wasn't possible on some level, I don't think we would understand anything, right? So I think really the question is, right, where does the listening happen from? I think the listening happens from something like the future. In that the future, you could say, seizes my attention, seizes my hearing. And so I comport myself to it, yet I realize that I'm not somebody worthy of that understanding. However, in attuning to it, as it reveals itself, it folds back, I believe, and attunes me to it. And there's a mutual disclosure that happens at the edge or the horizon of our own intelligibility, right? I think we could say that the where from which listening comes from, I believe it's in the world, right? And it's precisely in the world in which calls to the horizon, or what's beyond the horizon, which gives the ground, is the ground upon which I step forward, realizing that I don't know what I'm looking at, yet I feel attuned to it and atoned by it, and that mutual self-disclosure think is a very, very deep, almost hermeneutic way of